and in how companies are actually going to be valued, this isn't something that's a small conversation anymore. This is something that's actually business critical. They really have to do it. And if you do that, you attract the better talent, you retain the better talent, and actually the performance of businesses improves. So let's get back to those organizations that have maybe done well and responded well to this situation. Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy has done well. We now know that the backbone of these resilient companies is culture. Culture was a word that we used at length. I think culture is key was something that Gillian told us this morning, alongside courage and curiosity, accountability. So we know, as I say, that the backbone of these resilient companies that have done well is culture. They've moved from a modality of producing to creating. And the very survival of a company in the age of the coronavirus depends on this culture, a culture that can withstand massive disruption. Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy took the decision to refit many of its perfume production lines to actually make hand sanitizer instead. Microsoft, Google, Zoom all made their software free. The purpose of these companies goes way beyond the bottom line. Their cultures are strong. They have new leadership imperatives, focusing on inspiring human potential rather than driving productivity. They understand in these organizations that it's actually a time for we, not I. As I mentioned this morning in the panel session, Google research identified psychological safety as the number one key element in successful teams. And now trust has become effectively the only lubricant for the frictions caused by the pandemic. But what does that mean for employees and development? The Learning and Performance Institute has witnessed an enormous, again unprecedented, move in L&D, echoed by our panelists this morning. Every organization has been forced to look at digital and virtual solutions. Again, this is an accelerated change from what was already happening. But there's a difference now, and that difference is that this is urgent. And the significant challenge is in understanding where the learning is really happening. 88.6% of a recent European survey around L&D and preferences, the responses to that, 88.6% said that their preferred way of learning for work was virtual classroom, a huge shift from what had gone before. And this is true for all generations, but it's particularly true for the generation coming through. This is my son. When he returned from school a few years ago, I asked him what he was working on. He said, the Czech Republic. So I asked him what the capital of the Czech Republic was, and he said that he knew that. Yeah, I know that. And at the same time as he said that, he picked up his phone and Googled it. Now, he genuinely believed he knew it. Not that he was sourcing that information, but that accessing it meant that he knew it. Charles Jennings famously a few years ago referred to accessibility as having replaced knowledge retention as power within business. That was a few years ago, but I think things have moved on now. I don't think it's replaced knowledge retention as power. We'll look at that in a second. But let's be clear here. Graduates in 2021 will all have been born in the 21st century. They will have started school the year the iPhone launched. But some, if you're like me, that comes as a shock. But some will be starting work in businesses still rooted in 20th century practices. Companies are now realizing, and Tom from LinkedIn earlier mentioned this as well, that the combination of people and technology creates better performance. The people part of that equation is still important as we move towards digital learning solutions. The World Economic Forum issued a report on the most employable skills in 2020, and top of the list was critical thinking. And without the capacity to be able to think critically, we end up with answers to exam questions like this. Context is essential. Obviously, Getty Images is the source of that picture and not the name of America's first president. So the role of L&D now is to deliver learning digitally to a potentially remote workforce, reskilling and upskilling, as Wale mentioned this morning, and in many cases in very human content areas. When we analysed the fastest growing soft skills people are learning at work in 2020, we saw an increase in learning about topics like growth mindset, creativity, innovation. It's increasingly important for employees to adopt a growth mindset of continuous learning and be open to change in the workplace. Again, I'll repeat what happened this morning, being courageous and being curious, and companies providing the freedom for that. While skills training is key, building an organizational culture and leadership to nurture innovation and creativity is also critical. Employees themselves now are leaning into their innately human skill and that which robots can't do. Critical thinking, communication, storytelling, and emotional intelligence now top the list of fastest growing soft skills in 2020 in the workplace. But what do I predict will happen in workplace learning? Well, here's 5 quick predictions for you. Skills mapping will chart the future workforce. It will be essential. Large-scale technology disruption in the next decade, continuous skills mapping is going to become critical for workforce planning. This that you're looking at now is an example from the LPI Capability Map, a self-assessment tool for learning professionals. Forecasting future skills for an organization is not an easy task, and it's a common obstacle when we're implementing reskilling programs. In part, the challenge is that actually old and new roles aren't always a perfect match for reskilling. For many of these future jobs, there are no existing candidates externally with these emerging skills, and that makes internal reskilling the next best option. An example of this is Amazon, who are creating career training paths for warehouse workers to retool for new in-demand roles as data technicians at the company. Data analysis is actually the lowest performing skill across thousands of learning professionals around the world. It's an area that L&D really needs to look at. My second prediction is that focused capability academies will replace ad hoc training. Capability academies are in-depth training initiatives to develop and sustain skills capabilities that support specific business strategies, specific function areas. Companies often use an ad hoc approach for their talent building efforts. They hire new workers equipped with the desired skills or apply ad hoc training when needed. These quick fix tactics aren't enough anymore to transform an organization and to continuously keep up with the pace of technology and business change. Communities of practice will help keep skills up to date and quickly, rapidly, agile. So to complement in-depth learning offered by these capability academies I've just mentioned, social learning communities are on the rise to support learning on the job. For example, those of you that have ever worked in the software developer world, you'll know that industry standards change very quickly and they're often set by consensus. A group of developers may share a best practice and the industry will move in a new direction within hours. This makes it hard for us to keep up with best practices and to curate the right course material in order to upskill your team. The L&D function is going to rapidly reform, and it's going to do that sooner than we think. It was mentioned again earlier, but L&D is at the center of the fourth industrial revolution, front and center, and the massive reskilling that's required. However, the old L&D function of the last decade cannot effectively bring your organization into the future. In 2021, following recent events, we expect L&D teams to radically transform themselves. This involves a reshaping of the learning ecosystem to optimize learner experience. Skills, as I say, such as data analysis, performance consulting, digital content creation, they will all be essential rather than luxuries. It will also involve applying adaptive AI and personalization to learning, as well as tailored learning paths. Only 5% of organizations currently use AI, and 26% though are saying they plan to add it, according to a survey of L&D leaders, which we commissioned recently. Organizations are also going to build internal talent marketplaces. The old way of structuring your workforce based on fixed roles is not the optimal way to support a fast-moving business. Organizations will need to shift to more agile and flexible network teams focused on projects instead of fixed roles. Similar to how consulting firms or the gig economy operates. Team members will be selected for a specific project based on their skills, not their role. They may work at the same time on a diverse range of projects throughout the year, and teams can change based on the project. Organizations will need a new approach to managing talent in the era of flexible teams. To help managers find the right skill for projects, they will need to build an internal talent marketplace. Essentially, learning at work will need to be three things as we move into 2021. It must be compelling, cutting through the noise, being able to attract people, be marketed well. Learning needs now to have a magnetic pull. Constructive. It must fulfill a purpose for both the company and your colleagues. An L&D function needs to strike the right balance between stability and dynamism, assembling the components that will create a stable backbone, as well as the dynamism needed for the function to keep pace with an organization's learning needs. We think of the profit of our organizations as the North Star for an L&D function. We also need to be agile enough to be able to alter our course in response to learner needs and employee needs. And it needs to be convenient. There at the touch of a button, fitting into my flow of work and the way that I want to learn. Compelling, constructive, and convenient. Overall, these were rapidly changing times already, but now the accelerator pedal has been pressed down hard and companies are adapting every single second. I believe, and it was echoed this morning, that those with strong cultures and a desire to place learning and people at the heart of what they do have a much higher chance of success. Fostering a learning culture is the number one challenge for heads of learning right now, according to LPI data, and surveying 1,700 learning leaders allows us to believe that that is the case. So we have work to do. If we can get this right, we'll be driving organizational performance, maximizing human potential, and changing lives. Thank you very much. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ed. This is Michael Strawbridge. Hopefully you can hear me nice and clearly. I work with Ed at the Learning and Performance Institute, and I'm here really just to support him and take some of the questions that have been coming in. So, Ed, can I just pose a couple of questions to you as they've come in from the delegates? We have one from Caroline. And Caroline says, L&D's role is to deliver learning to a potentially remote workforce, reskilling and upskilling. Do you therefore think the classroom or face-to-face learning will return? And if so, to what level? Hello there, can anyone hear me? Hello?
Yes, Michael, we can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
You can hear me now. I did pose a question to Ed, but obviously you didn't hear it. Apologies.
We did.
The question that I was posing, Ed, was from Caroline, and Caroline was saying that you were talking about L&D's role, and L&D's role is to deliver learning to a potentially remote workforce, reskilling and upskilling them. Do you think that going forward, the classroom or face-to-face learning will ever return? And if so, to what sort of level?
And know that we can hear him and that I'm responding, that would be great. Yes, I think it's, as I say, a split decision. My personal view is that I believe face-to-face training will still have a role to play. It won't be as significant percentage-wise if you broke down a kind of timesheet analysis of how people are learning. But I think it's been an interesting evolution over this COVID-19 period in that there was, what I noticed was a desire to go with what was convenient straight away. I talked about compelling, constructive, and convenient. And people, first of all, very nervous about not being able to go to work. And then secondly, thinking, well, this is great, actually. You can use online platforms. And then that evolved into missing the real thing. I know that our team have wanted to see each other back at the office. So, and yet there's that argument that convenience will dictate that a lot of people don't want to go back in the office. So I think we're in a state of hybrid learning is how I would describe it, where I think there will be a combination of face-to-face as a premium for some types of interactions in learning, but the vast majority of learning will take place digitally for all the obvious reasons. It's scalable, it's global, it's recordable. I think that's why digital will dominate, but it would be a mistake, I think. And I'll share something with you, actually, that we have had more inquiries about having mentors, people wanting mentors through the LPI in the last 4 weeks than anything else. In the previous 6 months, digital learning and specifically upskilling in how to deliver virtual classroom training had a 1,300% growth at the LPI. So I think we're seeing a shift, and it was demonstrated in the challenges that we asked. We asked 1,700 CLOs what their top challenges were. The second most popular challenge was the digital transformation of L&D. The top challenge was how to build a learning culture, a very human thing. So we'll see both.
Thank you, Ed. Hopefully you can hear me again now nice and clearly. There's two questions that I want to put together, if I may. One of them has come in from Ken and the other one from Ezekiel. And what they're both asking, and I'll put the two together, is Ken is saying, what are the top skills needed for L&D professionals going forward? And then moving on from that, we need new approaches to manage talent in the workplace for tomorrow. How do we achieve this when you've just said that the accelerator pedal is down so hard and we don't know what's around the corner?
Great question. And I would urge people to hang around for the breakout sessions, because there are people who are eminently capable of answering those in a really succinct, articulate and eloquent way. We like to work with data at the LPI. I'm in a luxurious position of not always having to offer my subjective opinion on things, but having data support it. And there's a connection between what the organization requires from L&D or desires and a chasm of skills within an L&D function at the moment. And the number one area is data analysis, as I've mentioned today. That is something that organizations want from the L&D functions, true data. Kevin Yates, I'm sure, will touch on this afternoon, but also they want the skills to be able to analyze that data and appropriate the learning experiences to the gaps within the organization. And that's performance consultancy. So you have data analysis as a key skills gap, I think, in L&D, an area that I would encourage all L&D professionals to explore. You have performance consultancy, being able to correlate that which learning can provide with the requirements of the business. Again, that kind of North Star idea of understanding what your purpose is, purpose being a big part of this morning's session. And then I think the idea that we can, future-proof ourselves as an L&D function is probably something that we shouldn't be too concerned about, actually. And that may sound controversial. I don't mean that we should ignore it and stay doing what we're doing. Far from it. I mean that it's so difficult to predict the future, and learning has changed so much just in the last 6 months, that I would argue that the most important thing an L&D function can do right now is, just like Gillian was saying about individuals, is to be curious, talk to the business, and be agile in your responses. Be agile for the learners, your colleagues, and be agile for the business. Who knows how learning will be delivered in the future? It may be content driven, and we all get paid various amounts of money to speak at different events to explain what's going to happen. And only time actually tells who is correct on these things. But I've made my 5 predictions for L&D functions. My biggest prediction, my biggest suggestion and recommendation for anybody in L&D is to be agile and listen to the company and your learners and your colleagues.
Thank you, Ed. We've got questions coming in thick and fast. One from Nancy here. You've just talked about balancing dynamism and what have you. And what she's saying, the question that Nancy is actually asking, let me just bring it back up onto the screen. In your opinion, and in relation to L&D balancing between stability and dynamism, what big data should we be focusing on?
Well, you have two distinctly different communities that you would want data from. The organization is number one. So we're hoping, we're all hoping that L&D has high level representation within organizations. It's not always the case, but that's the first community of people. It's important to extract data from the company, find out what the purpose of the organization is and how they are going to be measuring you in terms of efficacy. Secondly, it's really important to have those casual conversations with learners and to look at where they're learning. I asked the question of the panelists this morning, what have they learned and where do they go to learn? I was recently asked who I think is the biggest learning organization in the world. And it would have to be Google. Google and YouTube would have to be the biggest learning organization in the world because it's where we go for our answers. So there is data out there. There's data on your intranet system in big companies. There's data from individuals who are at board level, strategic teams. Talk to them and find out how they're going to be measuring you. But equally talk to your colleagues and find out what their requirements are and where the real stuff is happening. It's kind of like an underworld within your colleagues probably. And more often than not, they go away from the L&D function to learn. They go outside of the organization and they find stuff on Google and YouTube. But as I mentioned earlier, the contextualization of that content, the appropriation of that content is where the L&D function has such a major role to play as a trusted advisor, curating and contextualizing content. I'll give you an example of where this was maybe not done well. The use of assets within business. And as I said earlier, the most important asset in a business is its people. I recently went to a company who were struggling with their sales side of things. And they had one person who was based in a different country who was selling way more than anybody else. They were fantastic. And they wanted to know how they could improve on their sales side as a learning company. It seemed really obvious to me. Let's find out what this individual is doing well and learn from them. But instead of, just talking to them one-on-one, let's see if we can record that content. Why don't you video record them, film them, and then you've got a set of videos as user-generated content that will help all the other salespeople. Now, unfortunately, ironically, the reaction of the company was that they didn't feel like they could allow this person to be away from his job for 2 days for the filming, which just seems such a false economy. 2 days of him not doing his job would mean everybody else was doing their job so much better in sales. So I get that it's difficult. I'm a pragmatic person. It's not always hard to get these things going, but it's so important to communicate with colleagues and with the board of your organization.
Thank you. Ed, I'm going to zoom straight on to another question which has come from Lammers. And if I pronounced your name incorrectly, I do apologise. Given that a disproportionate percentage of the labour force is employed by SMEs, to what extent can organisations with those smaller budgets and teams future-proof themselves?
I think that's about being where the learning is. I don't think it's ever been easier to utilise technology. And I don't mean the expensive, spending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands on necessarily LXPs or LMSs, learning experience platforms or learning management systems. But there's been a democratization of learning technologies and the exponential growth of that in the last 6 months. After COVID-19 and coronavirus, the third most searched for term was Zoom on Google throughout the last 6 months internationally. So, I think we're all starting this new response to the fourth industrial revolution in learning. I mentioned it in my presentation. There was already discussion about accelerated change, and now we are foot down on the gas, as they say, and going even faster to try and incorporate these things. I think we need to learn from other people. The LPI, as one example, has extensive networks, but there are networks everywhere. You can go on LinkedIn, I'm sure Tom would advocate that, and connect with people and learn from others in terms of what they're doing. I would really encourage that. And obviously attend sessions like these, and you'll find out how people are using technology. My wife is head of maths at a grammar school and now has to teach people both in front of her and online. And she has no experience in delivering virtual classroom training. And this is a new form of delivery that's just been sprung upon people. So I think we're all learning. I think we need to stop giving ourselves a hard time in learning and development because we're just trying new things and experimenting. Virtual classroom, without doubt, as we've all witnessed, is probably the optimal hybrid of people and technology because you're still getting that interaction, but I can do that at home and listen to Margaret opening this conference session, attend a training session with IFC, go onto LinkedIn Learning and do their self-paced stuff, and then maybe talk to my mentor online. So I think it's a case of trying stuff, experimenting.
This is fantastic. Our time is far gone. I don't know, Michael, is there any more questions for Ed? If not, then we'll have to move on, and probably we can answer those questions in the chat when we get the opportunity. So an amazing session, key learnings. Please share in the chat key learnings so Ed knows what you're taking away from his session. Please share in the chat key learnings. I've seen a couple of questions on online training. A key takeaway for me is be agile and listen to the company. And for key skills required for online training, you can visit the LPI website. They have an amazing certification program called Call Certified Online Learning Facilitator, which I just completed, and there's a lot of information there. I'm sure Michael or Ed will share more in the chat as we move into the breakout sessions. So I've got curate and contextualize content, key learning, be agile and listen to your company. Learning at work must be compelling, constructive, and convenient. So an amazing session, Ed. The future of learning. I think the future of learning from what you've shared is now. We are in the future right now. So we'll just move quickly into the breakout session. And thank you, Ed, once again for that insightful session. Hopefully the videos will be up on the website and we can watch it again and be able to write as much notes as we can. Okay. So remember to share on social media. We are now going into the breakout session and I'll just tell you what you should do. We've got 5 breakout topics. Breakout 1 is using data and AI for learning. We've got Peter Bankole and Kevin Yates in that session. They'll be properly introduced when you go into the session. We've got breakout 2, which is training, talent, technology, and trade-offs, which is being handled by Abdul and Carol. And then we've also got breakout 4, which is creating a learning culture. It's come up quite a lot, and it's being handled by Charlotte Mokina and Dr. Hannah Gore, an amazing group. And we've got breakout 5, the future of work, which is being handled by Amina and Miles Runham. So you can pick any, is the only session that you can just pick one and attend. Of course, you can go in and out if you want, but you will miss the essence of the discussion. So I recommend that you pick one that really speaks to you and stay in that session. So as you exit, please use the leave button, go back to stage and select which breakout session you want to be in. So we'll have to do that now together. Please click the leave button now. If you're a speaker, you go backstage. So go live and